Good morning. It's another Saturday. We're getting closer to spring here in this area anyway. I always think that I've found my favorite fairy tale and still until I move on to the next one, and then I think, "Oh no, this is my favorite fairy tale." And then I fall in love with them all over again because I see how rich they are and how much um, the symbolism just is so interesting. So today, if you haven't read the introduction, the description, we're going to talk about Sleeping Beauty. And in Sleeping Beauty, the things that are really important here are trust, and the question is what's been rejected. That's what the real focus is in this story. It begins like so many others. And when you have so many stories starting in the same way, you have to wonder, like, isn't this saying something that's bigger than just the personal, that's really speaking to what's happening in the culture? So once again, we have a king and queen in this story who cannot have a child. Wow, the sun just came out and that really messed up the lighting. Holy cow. So they can't have a child. Like, we've seen this in so many different stories. And what's so important about that is that it means there's no generativity. What does that looks like in our own lives is when we are living something and it's kind of this repetitive situation over and over again. And as I was thinking and reflecting on this, I thought it's really interesting in terms of looking at older generations. And when you go back in your own family, you might see how there was like this kind of, it was great for some of us because it represented stability. But there was really just this kind of simplicity to life that was just kind of the same one year to the next, other barring some unusual circumstance kind of showing up, right? It wasn't like they were in the process of always trying to evolve themselves and change themselves, which now is really so up in the collective. I mean, we see so many of us focused on whether it's self-help or spirituality or, all these different things that's all about growing and evolving and transforming ourselves as well as the culture. So you can see there's kind of this shift in what's happening within us as time has evolved. So here we have this king and queen that cannot have a child and they want a child. So here we have again this kind of focus on what is missing. So there's always in symbolically looking at a story, there's always multiple ways to perceive it. So you can perceive it on the one hand as this lack, like this feeling of lack, this feeling of something is missing. And what often happens, what we're conditioned in our culture, is to look outside of ourselves to fill that emptiness. And that is not actually, there's what's happening there is there's a misunderstanding of what's missing. Now, historically, we could say there's been an agenda to keep us focused outward, because then you're on a treadmill and you never get there. Because what's that feeling of what's missing is actually that inner connection and an inner experience of the soul. And that's what the feeling is that's missing. Although because the soul has been gone culturally and the feminine has been gone culturally for so many years, that we've talked before about so many years, you don't even recognize that something is missing. You don't recognize what is missing. And it's like you go in, you grow up and you follow all the rules, you tick all the boxes. I go to college and I get the good job, and then I'm in the job, and then I get married, and then I have a kid, and then I tick all the boxes for the path to happiness. And then Jung talks about this, the Swiss psychiatrist, and he says, at midlife, then people often wake up and say, I've ticked the boxes and I'm still not happy. And the reason is because he says, like, that's when the midlife crisis happens, because I did what I was told to do and it didn't give me the results, the feeling that I thought it would, and how I was going to feel when I finally made it, when I finally got here. And so that's kind of where we are in this story, right? So they feel like something is missing. So on the one hand, it can be a focus on the wrong thing, which would be a child, a literal child. But on the other hand, what it's missing is what that inner experience, not the outer situation that they think is going to fill the inner emptiness. So this can look in life, like I said, like you look in the past and historically, it can be like this repetitive loop, this repetition of I'm back in the same situation again. This situation keeps happening. It's like the classic, you marry you get out, you leave your parents' house and you marry your father. So you're kind of repeating where you were in the new location, or you get a new job and you end up with the same kind of boss again. And there's this kind of ongoing loop. So the question is, in that loop, in that inability to generate new life, right? It's like what if the feminine is missing? We talked about before, the feminine can represent that cultural, that cyclical nature of life. And so understanding the cycles of life means that you are know that there's like a fallow period, and then there's a letting go, and then there's a new life, and then it's being in that and embodying that in life. But in a culture where the masculine is, it's like all about summer. It's not about winter having value, or fall having value. It's all about more, getting more, being more productive. It's those other seasons that we often think of as being more associated with the feminine then are not perceived as having as much value. So what happens then is there's this kind of stuckness in the summer season, and there's no cycling through, which is what needs to happen. The going through the fallow period, going through the letting go, and then going through that winter time when things are gestating, when things are just like coming to consciousness, when there's in these periods of rest, these periods of renewal and regeneration. So this kind of cycle is not happening in the family. So when it's happening in life, we can see, because we're thinking that linear, always need to be going up, always need to be getting more, always need to be on that path, we can miss the necessity to have those other seasons in order to kind of move through life in a way that's evolutionary, and not in a way that's perceived. It's just basically, like I said before, that treadmill. You're just kind of on it, you're moving, you think you're moving, but you're not really getting anywhere in terms of consciousness evolving. So when you're caught in an old narrative of lack, which again we see in many fairy tales, then the question would be, what is missing? So each of us kind of have to go inside and see, what is it for me? What is this feeling? And what is truly missing? Not, a new car, a new house, a new job, a new location, but something deeper. What is that deeper thing, that longing, that deeper longing actually for? So to create true change in the outer requires this change in the inner. And a great example of this that you hear probably a lot is the lottery winners. The people who, they win the lottery, they get all this money, and then within a short amount of time, they're often right where they were before they won all the money. So the inner change hasn't happened, only an outer change, but the outer change wasn't sustainable because the inner corresponding change didn't happen. This isn't to blame anybody, but the understanding of how to do this just isn't a lot of people just don't have it. A lot of people just don't understand that that's a requirement in order to make it something be a sustainable change. The foundation is what's changing as we go through these stories. That's what we're focusing on, is foundation. How do we create foundational change that leads to a sustainable outer evolution of consciousness of life? So the next thing we have, first we open with they're wanting a child and can't have one. The next thing we have is the queen is sitting in a bathtub and she's bathing, she's cleansing. So again, as I said, with symbolism, we can have this mean multiple things. On the one hand, it can be like stuck, wallowing, sitting in the emotion, like nothing is moving. We could think of it possibly as that way. So the only way to discern in our own lives is to actually look at it. Am I stuck in the emotion, or is the emotion actually flowing? So we could say she's been in this situation for a long time, right? Which is why there has been no generativity. That this is the one of the things that's limiting the ability to generate new life. And so she's sitting in it. So we ask ourselves, are the emotions stagnant or are they flowing? And in this case, we would say, okay, there has been like a baptism, a cleansing, a purification that's happened in this particular moment because a frog emerges from the bathing water, which is you gotta love the fairy tales, right? Only in a fairy tale can you be sitting in the tub and magically a frog just comes out of the water. Hello. Where did you come from? Oh, I came from the ethers. So this indication of new energy coming forward. There's something new coming into consciousness. So in this moment, she's had enough, something has happened that's different than what was before. So we could say that this moment has been a cleansing, purifying moment to bring new energy and something new into consciousness in the form of a frog. And he has an announcement to make. He says, you're going to have a baby girl within 1 year. So what is the frog? He facilitates a transformation here, right? We could say this is almost a moment where this frog delivers the vision. He delivers the vision. He says, okay, this we saw just right, exactly like in the Handless Maiden, kind of a similar thing, although she didn't get a vision, but there was this time. There was this like, okay, the devil said, I'll be back in, I think it was 3 months. And so it was this period of waiting. And you see this a lot in the fairy tales, this waiting period. Well, what can happen is, and I've mentioned this before in the context of the Handless Maiden and also in The Wizard of Oz, you see when Dorothy's house lands in Munchkinland, she leaves Kansas, which again, which is great, another great story in terms of the evolution of cycle in the cycles of nature, because Kansas is stuck in summer. It's desolate. And then the house lands in the exact opposite, the polar opposite. And that means that there is life. It is true generativity is happening in Munchkinland, where there's like everything Technicolor and babbling brooks and fruiting trees and just life in chirping birds. It's just like a sensory overload almost. But she doesn't stay there. That's just the vision. Then she has to make the journey. That's how life works. That's what the cycles are like. You get the vision, but then it's not like you just get the vision and you get to keep it, right? That would be like the lottery money. The lottery money shows up and boom, you're there and it's all over. The journey comes. So they get the vision, we're going to have a baby, but now they have to make the journey, and their journey is going to be 1 year long, at least at this point, right? So the frog as a symbol, literally, actually can navigate between water and land. So this is interesting, right? Because land, earth, and water are both feminine elements. So there is some idea that the frog represents kind of a feminine aspect, they also leap. So that means it's not like this, it's not like that, like the difference between a frog and an ant. An ant would be like, small step by step progress, but the frog would represent kind of leaping. And so it's not that kind of small, steady stuff, but just actually bigger shifts happening in consciousness. So that's what the frog would represent. It symbolizes rebirth, transformation, and the moon because it sings at night, which means it's also linked to expression. As a totem, which is fascinating, I thought was fascinating, it's about raising your voice and being heard, about purging negative emotion, right? So that's a reference almost to the mother being in the, or the queen being in the water, the tub, and navigating between realms, which we could see, right? Because they can be in the water and they can be on land. So they have this ability to be in both places. So he is this is the something new arriving in the moment of cleansing. So if you do inner work and you sit in allowing the emotion to come and go, so you're just witnessing it. When you allow yourself to sit in what's coming up, then you can often get insights, and that is the something new that arises. You might understand like that you're looking at a pattern. Like in this story, we're going to look at like what's been rejected and ignored, and then if you're sitting and you allow the emotion of that to come up and to process it, not getting stuck in it, but allowing it to flow through just as a like a filter to cleanse, then what happens oftentimes is that you get to see what was the gift in this. That every wound has a gift. Wound, it's not like, technically, but it has a gift in it. And so what those insights come, and when you sit with something, it's amazing how much actually not only comes to consciousness through being in whatever is arising, but also it is like life is conspiring to bring this to consciousness and to assist you in this transformation, as I've often seen. And as I was working through this week, I do the work myself, and just so much information just comes day after day, and dreams and everything is completely supporting this bringing to consciousness. So the frog leaps forward. It's about being heard. It emerges from the water, which is something new coming to consciousness. So we examine the stories about what is. We examine what stories am I telling about what is. That's often how we can see the loops and the patterns. See what's the pattern that I'm in right now, and really looking at those things in order to discern what is happening in order, and what do I need to like accept and see. And in doing that, we can often shift through it. I find the dreams critical. So, you may find other things, but that for me has been just a tremendous help in terms of really guiding me through the process of transforming consciousness and setting me up for like the pieces all coming together. It works with life. It works with whatever I'm reading. I mean, everything. Post on Facebook. It all adds in to bringing greater consciousness to what's happening. So when the emotions are flowing and they're not stagnating or stuck or being rejected then and repressed, then that's a cleansing, right? After a good cry, you feel like, I feel like I'm, being cleaned on the inside out. So here we have the king, the queen, the frog, and then the announcement of a baby, which is 4, which again, we've talked before, is about wholeness, the number of wholeness. So we're kind of back to that, right? What's missing is the feminine, and what are we talking about here is we're moving into wholeness. So that's kind of the consciousness, the embodiment of the consciousness that we're moving towards. It already exists, but let's just say it's coming to consciousness. It's not like it's missing, but wholeness is just the natural state. So we're accepting what is in order to move forward, accepting how things are. So they wait for the first year, they get the vision, and then now they have to do the work and be patient. It seems like a long time sometimes between that vision and between the embodiment of the vision and living the vision. So just understanding and trusting, that's why I put that word trust, because you have these spells of time where you're waiting and you're processing and you're like allowing and trusting that there's a divine order here, that there's perfection in the unfolding, and trusting that life is on my side. This is working out for me. So we're focusing on what's wanted and not what's lacking, right? So they know that the baby's coming in a year. That is so helpful to know it's on its way. That's helpful in terms of keeping the focus on what the desire is, the goal is. Now here we're talking a little bit, right? It's again symbolism. We're talking in a story, we're talking a little bit about like outside and also about inside. So it can be kind of technically there is no difference. There's this kind of arbitrary inside outside. If you've ever experienced the soul directly, it's not in the body's in the soul. So these ideas of inside and outside are very much based on materialism that just, even physics has shown that it's just not accurate. So for the sake of the story and understanding and transforming consciousness, we can just talk about it as inside and outside. So we want to trust that I am working towards what I want. And again, we want to be looking for evidence that things are changing. Things are not stuck. They're not stagnating. I'm not in the same place. This is working. And so really noticing that things are evolving, that things are changing. And even if you're focusing on what's wanted and the exact opposite shows up, you might say, oh, this is just not working. But it's working perfectly. That's evidence that it's working, because as you focus on what's wanted, the polarity in the unconscious will come up into your awareness. So the dreams will come that are the exact opposite. An experience may come as the exact opposite in order to clear the emotion or the beliefs that often have been inherited and may not even have been directly experienced in your own life, in the sense of, oh, there was a wound that happened to me in my lifetime. We talked about this before, right? Because it can be cultural. It can be cultural, and it is cultural, but also personal, but also ancestral. So we have all these different layers that can be. So it's about not judging, just allowing and accepting whatever is coming to consciousness, just allowing it to come and allowing it to be. So in this waiting, we're receptive. We're allowing ourselves to be receptive, and we're healing more deeply. So receptivity can be a challenge, as we talked about, like with the Handless Maiden. And it's allowing, because when you're in the receptive mode, when you're waiting, if there have been challenges in life, that it can be really uncomfortable to sit in the unknown, to sit in the uncertainty. And as we talked about, there are cycles. What can happen is, so if you're working with this polarity, then what happens is, like in this case, where it's say, like, is we're talking about the missing feminine. So in this case, what would happen is those things that are identified with what was the old version of you, let's say, will begin to fall away. And you'll be in this emptiness. You'll have all kinds of uncertainty and unknown, not knowing how it's going to resolve, not knowing when it's going to resolve. And you can begin to think you're doing something wrong. There's something wrong with you. Instead of just allowing this emptiness, depending on how big the transformation is you're working on, will determine how much emptiness there is. If you have emptiness in one area where, say, friendships are changing, whether you have an emptiness in another area, say where your work is changing or a partner is changing, or you can go through these bigger transformations where it's happening in every area at once, which is particularly fun, I must say. But just know this is a moment of really changing the foundation and really shifting that foundation from the world of form. When you're in the emptiness, it's about source, going deeper, allowing those roots to drop down more into the earth, into the depths of knowing of the universe. The universe is the support, the source is the support. It's not the world of form. So it's really shifting, and which I think this story really exemplifies so beautifully, is this deeper shift. So we're witnessing the feelings, and that's creating greater stability, right? So the feelings come, you allow them to pass, and then there's deepening into those roots, into the earth, and that's what's going to create the stability. My guides gave me this morning the name of Joseph. So if you're familiar with Joseph in the multicolored dream coat, which of course is why I found out about him in the first place, he went through all kinds of challenges and isolation and where he wasn't believed and wasn't listened to and was rejected and excluded. And that was the journey that put him in the place to be a leader. So these challenges, the culture looks at one way, the being in these spaces, and the reality is not so. The reality is that there's a different story here. There's a different thing happening here. And so it's trusting. Like I said before, trust is so important. Being patient is so important. There's a deeper thing happening here. And those who go through the big challenges are often the ones who lead during challenging times in the culture, which of course we can see are happening all around us. So life is unfolding perfectly. So as more we can drop into ease about what's happening, feel what comes up and allow it to be, the more we can really shift these old narratives, the beliefs, the emotions, whatever needs to transform in order to step into this new version of who you are is going to come up. And the more that we are allowed and allow it to transform, the easier the journey will be when we trust. So we need to feel safe for the young feminine to emerge and come to consciousness, right? So to be born, my dreams have told me that there needs to be safety. My guides have reiterated this as well. When the feminine feels safe, she will come out. So it's really setting that up in the nervous system, in the body, to be able to relax in not knowing, to relax and trust when I'm in uncertainty, when chaos, when things are just falling away. It's okay. I'm okay. Everything is okay. I'm not 5. I'm not 7 anymore. I'm an adult now. It's all right, right? To just soothe that inner child who is like, this is a disaster. This is not good. Okay. We're not living. We just tell her, just, take her in our lap. It's all okay. Everything's all right. And just allow her to feel soothed when that fear comes up around being in the uncertainty and the unknown. So they are waiting for 1 year, and then the baby comes. The young feminine. This is the historically feminine soul that has been rejected, is now coming back into consciousness. Woohoo! We're all happy about that. And so the king is rejoicing. And so we talked about that we've been conditioned to look outside for this fulfillment, but the deeper desire is for this missing feminine. Now is coming into consciousness, right? The queen receives the frog message. She gives birth, and then we don't really hear from her again. It's like this, the king is celebrating. The king is excited. Like, we don't hear from her. So in one sense, she almost represents like now this mother steps back in consciousness. We could say she's silent, so which we've seen so many times, this kind of marginalization of the mother. So we'll just kind of set that aside for one moment. Like, is she the silent mother now? Let's just see what's going to happen. So the king wants to have a celebration. He wants to celebrate the birth of this baby. So he wants to invite the wise women in the land. The wise women are going to all come together. So you could, on the one hand, say like that the silent mother represents, like, she did the cleansing and the purification that was required in order for now the wise women to come into consciousness. So wise women are that are equal to like witches, to the time when women were more connected to nature. Herbalists, they knew how to work with the herbs. These women were independent, they were empowered, they could not be controlled. That's why they were a problem. That's why the culture, and in particular the masculine, saw them as an issue, was because they could not be controlled. This is what the wise women represent. Clarissa Pinkola Estes talks about them, right? That the words are all the same, witch, wise woman. It's the same thing. So here we have the wise women. He invites. They're in tune with harmony. They're in tune with life. They're in harmony with nature. They know and remember what the mother doesn't, right? They're the wisdom now coming to consciousness. They represent the cycles of nature. The wise women represent wisdom coming to consciousness at the same time that the baby comes. So what does the baby bring with it? She brings with her wisdom, which is cool, isn't it? The more that we work with the feminine, that's where the wisdom comes from. So let's see. There are 12 wise women invited by the king because there are 12 plates. But there are 13 wise women, so one gets excluded. Not enough, again, in consciousness. Well, what's interesting about the number 12 is we think of like 12 as the disciples, 12 as the months of the year. But if you've heard anything about the months of the year, the days of the week, you might have heard, or even the holidays we have. Somebody with an agenda sliced things up that was not according to the way it used to be. So anything associated with pagans was basically taken on, shifted, attached to something else, often Christian, and they didn't allow, because they wanted to take away all the, cover over, let's say, all the things that were perceived as pagan. But 13, which would be the 13th wise woman who is excluded and not included, 13 is the feminine number. So 12, we have the disciples and the months of the year, but 13 is related to the moon cycles. See, isn't that interesting? So you might think like, well, really, we probably should have had 13 months and not 12 months. But que sera, sera. So 13 is a number that symbolizes fertility. Isn't that fascinating? And the goddess. So goddess is independence. Goddesses, I mean, like looking at the goddesses historically, right? What did they represent? Venus and the whole pantheon. They were empowered. They were independent. They did their own thing. They often had gifts. They were strong. They weren't, like, in general, controlled by the masculine the way that the perception is of like humans were. So they represent something different, something empowered, something, a power inside of us that is beyond the ordinary and the human. So the divine feminine was ejected and evicted from the culture. It's right? They used to be in the stories. They used to talk about the goddesses and the gods. And then when Christianity came along, no more. Now we're just talking about the, of course that's changing now, but there was this shift. And we saw it even in the stories. So if you read my book, Initiation of the Soul, which these videos are based on, you saw that I started with Psyche and Amor in that chapter in Apuleius's book because Venus was still in the story. And so what's interesting is Venus was angry because she was neglected and rejected. The culture was this story marks the shift from when, in which you can witness, where there's this movement from the goddess and from worshiping the goddess to worshiping the human. And that's why Psyche gets into trouble with Venus, because the humans are now worshiping Psyche as the embodiment of Venus. So they're neglecting her temples. They're neglecting, right? Then what you see is the evolution of the story becomes Beauty and the Beast, where the goddess isn't there anymore. So there's this change in fairy tales from the myths where the divine feminine is no longer visual. You no longer see her. You no longer hear from her. She's completely gone. So the 13th wise woman represents this link to that goddess who has been disappeared, who has been excluded from the story, excluded from the celebration. And so you want to ask, like, what is rejected and excluded in me and in the culture? And really noticing that. And she represents change, she represents transformation, and she represents rebirth, which again is fascinating because now this links back to the frog, similar energies that they represent. So there's superstition around the number 13 and fear around it, right? And it's associated with the feminine. Well, isn't that a big surprise, or just a coincidence? So in the tarot card, it's 13 represents the death card, which again means the end of an old phase and the beginning of a new phase. So there's something indicating this fairy represents this real transitory moment between what was the old story and a brand new story. That's why this story is so critical and important for us, because it's going to show us what is this transition right now in the consciousness of us and in the consciousness of the culture. So in this celebration, they include the wise women that are going to bestow good qualities on the baby. So we're going to give you happy things and nice things like beauty, wealth, and virtue. And then what happens is that they don't explain everything that's given to her. They just name those three, and then they say, and every good thing anyone could wish for. All the good little things, sugar, spice, and everything nice. So then what happens? They all come in and bestow their blessings on this little baby, and then whong, in comes the 13th fairy, ripped, right? She's mad. She's been excluded. If you've ever had this happen to you, you know how this can feel. If this is an issue for you, being excluded, rejected, ignored, or having some part of you done that, you can notice, even looking back in your lifetime, those moments when inexplicable, something was disturbing, didn't know what it was, but looking at in yourself what it was that wasn't acknowledged. And we talked about this before in terms of it can be something that is, if you have a narcissistic parent, it can be a little bit more pointed about you not being, seen, heard, whatever, having needs. But it can also be really subtle. Like you have a family who's intellectual, who's all about education, who's all about, reading and learning. And then you show up and you're creative, or you show up and you are musical, or sports minded, of all things, which would be probably the polarity, the opposite. And it's just that they don't see it. They're not being malicious. They're not being intentional. It's just not something that's been valued, that they really, notice. So then that can go into the unconscious, because it's not seen and heard. Anything not seen and not heard and not validated as a child goes into the unconscious. So the 13th wise woman shows up furious and comes in to curse the baby. She says when the young girl turns 15, she will prick her finger on a spindle and she will die. So 15 years old would be this transitional point, right? from child to young maiden, and that would be a critical shift point. And lots of times you can see in our Western culture that, 13, 14, 15 is often, usually for us, it's a little bit younger, that girls finally like get the message, like, okay, the masculine's more valued here than I am as a feminine, and they begin to like change. They begin to push back those qualities that they're noticing, even not consciously always, but noticing aren't as valued. So again, things are changing. We're in the process right now of all this coming to consciousness, but the story is talking about that transitory period of allowing those parts of the self that are identified with the feminine in this case to come to consciousness, to have value. Hard if it's not being validated by the family, but if they're not aware of this and bringing and noticing and bringing these things to consciousness in themselves. So this transitory point where the qualities or the feminine goes back into the unconscious. So yeah, and I've gone over time a little bit, so I'm going to leave it there. Which is just, isn't this fascinating? I just love this story. Sorry about the lighting in here. Hopefully next week I will do better with that. But thank you for coming. Happy Saturday. So just noticing in yourself, like if there's something that has been ignored, rejected, didn't receive attention, and it's really noticing the anger can point to it, but what's underneath the anger is usually grief. So it's allowing that grief to come to consciousness and allowing that grief, the emotion, to flow and not getting caught in it. And understanding that means it's transforming. So, okay. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for listening. Saturday mornings, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Have a great day.